Women are portrayed in many different ways in pop culture, like the cutesy sidekick, the rebellious tomboy, or the wily seducer. But those aren't usually the prima donna. The main stereotype that tends to find its way into the spotlight time and again in Western culture is the, what should we call this? The picture-perfect princess. These women are usually tall, slender, statuesque. They have a supermodel vibe about them. They're usually princesses, have status or authority, they're virtuous, have few flaws, and if it sounds like I'm describing an ideal rather than a person, it's because I am. It's kinda like when the dungeon master asks what kind of character you want to play, and you go,
I want to be Gygax, the 27th level warrior mage, with a plus 18 soul-sucking sword and...
The problem is that feminine ideals are either embodied by physical traits like beauty, or by things like kindness, patience, demureness, nurturing motherliness. They're, in other words, boring. Or at least, it's easy for them to come across as boring to most guys, some of whom end up writing many of these characters. And the other problem, like I alluded to earlier, is that when it comes to fleshing out a character of the opposite sex, it's easy to fall into the trap of writing an ideal instead of a character. You can see this on both sides of the fence, even women writing men, with concoctions like Twilight's Edward Cullen or 50 Shades' Christian Grey.
That's the one!
Both of whom come across as the shower thoughts of a teenage girl exhibiting comically masculine traits, or, once again, a 14-year-old girl's idea of masculine traits, and who are virtually impossible to relate to. They're hyper-attractive, hyper-masculine, and still hyper-gay somehow. It's cool. It's nice to have a window into what the other gender wants, and realize how comically far away from it you are, but that's more or less the utility you get from it. That and masturbation. I mean that literally, it's fap material. It's easy to write your broad idea of the other gender from the outside looking in and end up with not a person, but the avatar of femininity/masculinity itself. And there's nothing wrong with trying to portray an ideal through a character. We do that all the time. In fact, it's most of what we do through stories, but characters should be, characters first, and ideals second. And the triple Ps are often guilty of this. Jean Grey is a pretty powerful, popular, high-ranking Omega-level mutant and protege of one of the most powerful mutants on Earth. She gets her own legendary status comic book where everyone fights to save her, everyone loves her, everyone wants to bang her. And I don't get why. Don't get me wrong, I understand it on paper. She saves everyone at the beginning of that comic at the cost of her own life. She's very pretty, and that's enough to want to stuff her like a piñata. But those are very generic traits that don't show us who Jean is, and why we should develop an attachment to her on a human level, to her personality, her quirks. Kitana is a 10,000-year-old princess from another world. She's almost immortal, she's royalty, and somehow also supremely moral and just and stoic, and she doesn't really have any hobbies or personality to speak of beyond that. And Wonder Woman is also a princess, also practically immortal, also godlike and strong and fair and just and stoic and... And she's blue-eyed, dark-haired, dressed in the American flag and flies and is invulnerable and has super strength just like Superman does. While you're reeling from the staggering creativity on display, I shall attempt to ascertain whether women themselves like these woman characters based on the sample size of whatever women I happened to talk to about this topic. Yes, unlike you cave dwellers, I actually talked to women, once or twice. That's how I know they talk back. They always talk back. And when it comes down to it, it's pretty much 50-50. Half love and admire them, half think they're boring, unrelatable fucks with no personality. Now the caveat with the former half is that they seem to like the princesses for what might commonly be called shallow features, like being pretty and... that's it. Being pretty, being strong, which is coincidentally what the male brains like about them too. Perhaps we're not so different after all. To which you could also add, mostly on the female side, the quality of being a hero who is a woman, which is like me being proud of wanking with the left hand instead of the right, because I'm a special snowflake. But on the other hand, shallow is a shallow word. There's nothing wrong with beauty and aspiring to be beautiful. Visuals are important, right, Kenshi? And when it comes to the other 50% who hate them, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, is because they don't aspire to have those traits, and they don't aspire to have those traits because
"Ya ugly."
And so they don't even try. And I would love to reiterate that this is not always the case. And no wonder, why should we appreciate you for traits that you were born with and haven't worked for a day in your life? Seems pretty arbitrary, really. It should be more about testing the character and personality underneath those features. Just kidding, we both know you don't have any. But on the other hand, what's wrong with appreciating the splendid specimens of life? Guys do it all the time with their figureheads. Whereas the female hive mind consensus seems to be the same as the stance of political superpowers in 2025, which is something like kill or screw over everything that is not them. So there are reasonable arguments and counter-arguments to all of these stances. No, what are you doing? Come on, they know this. Female tendencies to praise and want to be these women, but simultaneously hating them in real life notwithstanding. The PPPs are sort of a necessary illusion and ideal that women have to strive for, knowing they'd never reach it, nor do they want to reach it. It's more that unrealistic ideal brings out their ambition and allows them to reach their best selves, even if they fall short. It's the same for us. Like they say, aim for the sun and land on the moon, or aim for the screen and land on the keyboard. It's not so much a question of liking these characters, it's more about obtaining as many of their tools as possible. Just like how it's not that girls like or fall in love with a guy's money, status, and muscles, but it sure as shit is helpful to have those tools. Wonder Woman's character was created during World War II. The character in the story was initially depicted fighting Axis forces, although over time her stories came to place greater emphasis on characters, deities, and monsters from Greek mythology. Many stories depicted Wonder Woman freeing herself from bondage. Many writers have depicted Diana in different personalities and tone. What has remained in constant existence and is a mainstay of the character is the dichotomy of her dominant force aspect and her nurturing humanity. Her overwhelming belief in love, empathy, compassion, and having a strong conscience. Now see, that's the thing. I agree that most of these are feminine virtues and worth portraying, but I also think that most of them haven't been enacted well enough on screen. There is no set of traits that I can point to and say, yeah, that's so Wonder Woman. There is a set of traits that I can point to and say, yeah, that's every generic woman hero ever. That could be Wonder Woman, could be Jean Grey, could be Kitana, could be your mom. Just kidding, we both know she's no bastion of virtue. I'd say that of all of these, the trait that has been portrayed the best is the naivete, the fish out of water thing. In the first Patty Jenkins Wonder Woman movie, my gal Gal Gadot did such a great job being clueless about the modern world and channeled that into many cute, heartfelt, entertaining scenes. Most versions in most medias, however, default to this very safe, very generic collection of traits that don't help the character stand out one bit. This problem partly extends over to DC characters as a whole, because most of them err on the stoic side. Batman is stoic, Superman is stoic, Wonder Woman is stoic, Jon Stewart is stoic, Martian Manhunter is stoic. So many stiff statues, it's a wonder the Justice League show squeezed out so many heartfelt moments out of them. The crux of the lesson is this: the more you tilt your characters to one singular trait, virtue, or ideal, the more they start to feel the same. In the newer Mortal Kombat games, you basically have the serious character and Johnny. That's it. You have characters that sound like this.
It is nothing, Liu Kang.
The last vestiges of my demonic form.
As was your repugnant spawn. I must speak with the Elder Gods.
Why were the demons after you?
Do not lose faith in the spirit's reign.
You befoul these hallowed grounds.
And one character who sounds like this.
No shit.
Everyone that's not Johnny Cage sounds like they have a marble floor up their ass. Overly serious and robotically monotone, and they will die before they will use a single apostrophe. These are not different characters, they're the same character as far as speech patterns, demeanor, and view of the world are concerned. And it doesn't have to be seriousness or stoicism, this applies to any one trait. Over in Marvel land, they went for pretty much the opposite trait, whereby every character started to mesh into the same insufferable, cheap one-liner machine after a while. The bottom line is simple traits like honor, compassion, or stoicism are not enough. Characters need more than that. They need a host of very specific quirks that makes stoic, compassionate character A set themselves apart from stoic, compassionate character B. And this brings us to Katara from Avatar: The Last Airbender, because Katara may actually be the right way to portray this archetype, and one of only such examples, because you can just barely point to her collection of just specific enough traits and say, yeah, that's Katara. Oh, sorry, that is Katara. Or more likely, yeah, that sounds like this feminine archetype, and it's probably Katara that you're describing. And that probably Katara at the end comes from the fact that Katara does, in fact, have some of those specific quirks that I mentioned. Because Katara is, on the surface, just a generic member of this picture-perfect archetype, but she sets herself apart by being A, a teenager, B, a sister, and C, the member of a tribe. In other words, a peasant. Just by having these three elements as part of the character's background and identity, the writers were able to elevate her from the baseline baseline triple P template into something much more specific in a number of ways. By being a girl and a sibling, Katara naturally displays a lot of caring, encouragement, and motherly instincts, but because she's also a 14-year-old tribeswoman from the edge of the world who's desperately trying to learn waterbending, she often undercuts those aforementioned traits with jealousy, impetuousness, competitiveness, and spite. One minute she'll be teaching Aang and encouraging him on, the next, she'll get jealous when she sees he learns much faster and is much more talented than she is. One moment she'll be calm and in control of her emotions, the next she'll snap at you and or break down under the enormous weight of the trauma she carries from having lost her mother at a tender age, and feeling the need to step up as a motherly figure as a result of that. The show could have admittedly done more for her, but it's a significant step up from many of her counterparts. Now, I may or may not have some redesign ideas for Wonder Woman in a video that may or may not be up by the time you're watching this, so you may or may not see it linked in the cards. Jean Grey is generally a beloved figure, generally in the comic space, because she hasn't shown much in the films, and generally because of the Dark Phoenix saga, but that's less about her and more about the X-Men themselves coming together for her to try and save their friend against impossible odds. Oh, and she's also beloved in the animated series, but for the wrong reasons. She has been a student and a teacher, as well as the tether between good and evil. Jean Grey was always a really popular character for readers. Partly it was because she was one of the most sensitive and intelligent members of the X-Men, the heart of the team. So far so good. The fact that she was the team's first woman also made her unique, and her beauty was a major source of crushes for the fans. She was also involved in a love triangle between herself, Cyclops, and Wolverine. I think I'm gonna be sick. Marvel decided to do something that hadn't really been done before, take one of its greatest superheroes and turn her into one of its greatest supervillains. See, this is what I like to call liking a character for all the wrong reasons. Her immense empathy and sensitive side are good, and they check out with her and Xavier's powers, depicting empathy as both a superpower and a super weakness, something that the film franchise, most notably First Class and Days of Future Past, did very well for Charles, but not for Jean. So that's all well and good, but everything that comes after that is im special because im whammon, im pretty, barf-inducing love triangles, and pulling an Injustice Superman, which, after years of Injustice-type media, we finally reached the public consensus that it's not that interesting of an idea. I'm sure it was somewhat novel at the time of the Dark Phoenix saga, but as with Superman, turning such a fundamentally good character evil makes for a pretty drab, over-the-top villain. Jean is an incredibly complex character. She's loyal, fierce, compassionate. She's been the weakest and she's been the most powerful. Jean was such a beloved character that the Dark Phoenix saga was retconned so that Jean could be returned to the comics. Originally, Phoenix was the ultimate expression of Jean's power as a psychic, but because of the horrendous deeds Dark Phoenix committed, it was decided to make the Phoenix a separate entity that copied and became Jean instead of Jean herself. This allowed Jean to be resurrected and acquitted of the crime of destroying an entire solar system. Jean's empathy is what makes her such a beloved character. Does this read to anyone else like the biggest cop-out in storytelling history? No? I mean, maybe it is just me, but there's a lot of me to go around. Rather than have the balls to kill one of the chief characters in the story, they pulled an episode 9. Rather than have events be shaped by Jean's powers, they're shaped by magical space dust. And rather than allow the character and her friends to wrestle with some truly evil deeds that she's done, we're gonna conveniently pin all of that on the aforementioned cosmic dust and completely kill any kind of moral discussion around the topic. The only piece of media that fleshes out both Jean as well as the reactions and commentary that other characters would output about her is X-Men Evolution, my second favorite show, where the characters are treated more like people and less like stoic action figures, a lot of which stems from the genius decision to portray most of the characters as teenagers. Teenagers which are far more likely to output emotion, speak their minds, do stupid stuff, and thus the portrait of Jean Grey starts to become much clearer. The characters start to say what we're all thinking about her. Rogue is jealous of her, thinks she's a precious little princess, and calls her Miss Popularity. Shadowcat thinks she's bossy sometimes. Her female classmates think she's a weirdo and hate her for having Scott's attention, and Scott thinks... So there's a large number of girls that either hate Jean or want to be Jean, usually both. And I propose to you that it's that way in real life too. Half the female fans love Jean, the other half hate her guts, and there's a lot of crossover between these two emotions. By the way, Avatar, X-Men Evolution, it's funny how all of these characterization problems start to get solved when you make the characters children. I think it's no coincidence that Kitana and Melina are, by far, the two most beloved female characters by women. That's because Kitana covers everything that girls aspire to be, while Melina accounts for the remaining, less desirable traits. A hyperbolic cocktail of unrestricted hunger, greed, desire, spite, and total abandon that is there, but cannot be shown or condoned by society. The fact that the two characters are twins is just icing on the cake, really. Makes the psychology behind it that much clearer. And of course, if you asked a female fan what she likes about Kitana, she'd go on to mention a bunch of physical traits, as there's not much in the way of personality. And that's all fine and dandy. It mirrors real life well enough, since most unreasonably beautiful people tend to not develop much of a personality because they don't need to. But 10,000 years? 10,000 and you still talk like the pre-alpha version of ChatGPT? That's a tad unlikely, don't you think? You're also the surrogate daughter of a murderous psychopath and one of the most powerful, successful conquerors of all the realms. I'd expect to see some more nuance to your character, some highly contrasting thoughts and feelings competing to occupy real estate within your mind. We never see any of that. She's always just a chick who refuses to use apostrophes. Now, a while ago, I made a video discussing Boy Scouts, aka morally squeaky clean, goody two-shoes male heroes like Superman and Captain America, and how they're underrated and poorly represented in popular media, and I'd be the biggest hypocrite if I praised them while simultaneously soft criticizing arguably the female counterparts without explaining myself. First of all, as I mentioned, I also criticized the Boy Scouts and how they're adapted into films and shows and the like, and that they're done much better in some of the comics and cartoons. So really, both the guys and the girls are done dirty in most movies and shows. The only difference is that, as far as I can tell, the princesses don't have that much more to work with in the comics department either. And here's another difference: the Boy Scouts all present greatly contrasting traits that make them a bit more interesting. Superman is seen as this larger-than-life god among men, but in his private life, he's the most regular, down-to-earth guy you've ever met. He likes visiting his parents, helping them with chores, chilling by himself, exchanging gifts for Christmas, and still believing in Santa like the hopeful dork that he is. Captain America looks like the perfect soldier, but he's just a forthright, upbeat kid underneath. He's modest, naive, he got that 1930s charm, and he has no idea how to talk to women because his self-image is still exactly what I just described instead of the superpowered, tempting hulk of man-flesh that he is now. Meanwhile, the Girl Scouts don't present as many contrasting tidbits. The way they present themselves to the world is the way they present themselves in private, even to themselves alone. You have to remember, it's the quirks, the minor traits, the tiny flaws and shows of vulnerability that make these characters interesting, that make all characters interesting, and make us all go,
How nice to find a flaw.
Once again, Gal's Wonder Woman did have some of that and was a big part of why that movie was so successful. Her naivete was used to great effect, with her wondering, frustrated why people can't all just get along. A very feminine, very simplistic and naive, but well-intended sentiment that most women share, and an important lesson for Diana about the complexities of human nature that she did not learn, because even though the film had the good idea of making this about more than just a punching contest, it still resorted to a big dumb fight at the end against a big dumb god who, despite claiming to be mostly innocent, still spread the whispers of war into man's ear. Why not go all the way with it? How ironic is it that the female-led superhero film is the one with commitment issues? How much cooler would it have been if Diana had to convince people to stand down and stop fighting using persuasion and charisma and wit, rather than fight a CGI Elden Ring boss at the end? How much more elegant of a character would Ares have been if he, the god of war, did not fight in the end? Wasn't interested in fighting? If, despite Diana's insistence on blaming him for everything, he's just like,
I don't do that, Kevin!
And you realize that he really is just a tourist in all of this, all because of man's choice to engage in war and violence and conflict. And once Diana solves that problem, he grows weaker and more human looking, but he also offers her a round of applause, genuinely impressed by her unexpected victory, and disappearing into the shadows with a bow and a smirk, defeated but not beaten nor humiliated. A much more elegant victory. Enough tangent. Speaking of contrast, is not just internal contrasting features within the Boy Scout characters that's neat, but the contrast with the external world as well, as the best kind of plot of these characters is one that focuses on trying to corrupt them in various ways. Failing ultimately, of course, but coming very close and making some good points and tempting offers on the way. It's a moral battle, and it's fun to see a person trying their best to be a good man in spite of all the shittiness around them. There's often something to tempt these heroes to abuse their powers or to move the boundaries of their own morality just an inch further, and then another inch, and another one, etc., etc. It's interesting to watch, but Wonder Woman generally just starts fighting goons with her fists and ends fighting goons with her fists. A most masculine solution. Kitana's more or less the same way. There's no interesting tugging of her morality apart from the very beginning, which often happens off-screen or is multiversed out entirely. And Jean trips and falls and goes, Look, olive branch time. There's no inherent problem with depicting this kind of archetype. I'm sure it'll continue to find its way into the spotlight time and again, because it's an ideal, like I said, and an indelible image in our subconscious. But perhaps future iterations could benefit from being a bit more human, more vulnerable, more quirky and imperfect beneath the surface, kinda like you. If you derived any usefulness from this, do comment what it is, cause I have no fucking clue what this video even is. Eat your veggies, do your push-ups, and don't forget to like. Special thanks to Serhi Hrishin and Longthorn Henderson, as well as my other members for supporting the channel. Look, I meant peasant literally, it wasn't a jab at your manners or anything.